So friends, if you have ever taken a class in either business or management, you may have heard the name Jack Welch. His name appears in a lot of those kind of textbooks. And that is because from the year of our Lord 1981 all the way to the year 2001, Jack Welch was the CEO of the great American company General Electric. And under his leadership, that company went from being valued at a paltry $14 billion to, at the end of his tenure, being valued at $410 billion. I don't care who you are, that is pretty dang impressive. But as I think we all know, success like that does not come without its fair share of controversy. And indeed, in his time, Jack Welch was quite the controversial figure. And he was controversial because he championed a style of management that came to be known as rank and yank management. Have you heard of this? Rank and yank management. So in this style of management, what you do is on a regular basis, you give your employees a frank assessment of their performance within your organization, usually on a monthly basis. Then on an annual basis, once a year, you fire the bottom 10% of performers, right? So you rank them and you yank them. Interestingly though, when pushed on this topic in interviews, Jack Welch would double down on it, and he actually defended this style of management as, get this, kind and loving. He says rank and yank management is the most kind and loving form of management out there. Listen to what he says in his own words. I've come to learn that the worst kind of manager is the one who practices false kindness. I tell you, you think you're a nice manager, that you're a kind manager. Well, guess what? You won't be there someday. You'll retire or you'll be promoted, and a new manager will come in, and they will look at your employee and they'll say, hey, you're not that good. And then all of a sudden, this employee is now 53 or 55 with many fewer options in life, and they're going to be told, go home. How is that kind? How is that loving? No, I tell you, you are the cruelest kind of manager. Now, we might not particularly like this rank and yank form of management. We might not want to see it employed in our own workplaces, especially if we suspect that we ourselves might be in that bottom 10% of performers. But he has a point, doesn't he? He makes a really strong point there. And in fact, it is the very same point being made in this morning's reading from 2 John. Namely, that there is a deep and intrinsic connection between love and truth. You cannot have one without the other. They go hand in hand. And while pretty much the whole of 2 John elucidates that idea, I think where John really drives this point home is in verse 3. Verse 3, where he says this, he says, grace, mercy, and peace, which come from God the Father and from Jesus Christ, will continue to be with us who live in truth and love. Or put a little more simply, grace, mercy, and peace will continue to be with us who live in truth and love. Or put another way, in order to be the kind of people among whom there is peace, in order to be the kind of people among whom there is mercy, in order to be the kind of people among whom there is peace, we need both love and truth. We need them both. Do you recognize What a profound insight this is for us, if somewhat counterintuitive. Do we recognize what a big insight this is? Because most of us, I'd say probably 9/10 of us, especially those of us who count ourselves as conflict avoidant, right? We don't really believe that's true. We act as though grace and mercy and peace in our community depend on there being love minus the truth. What we really believe is that in order to be in a peaceful community, you need to ixnay on the ooth tray, so to speak. And so what do we do? We hide uncomfortable truth from one another, right? You hurt my feelings. You said you were going to do something, and then you left me hanging. You're acting crazy right now. We don't know why, blowing up all sorts of personal relationships. Some crazy stuff happening over there. We hide uncomfortable truth from one another. And we do so in the misguided belief that telling the truth is in fact not a loving thing to do. In fact, we believe that the opposite is true. We believe that telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth will not lead us to grace and mercy, but will instead to lead us to conflict and hurt feelings. And so believing that we are being merciful, again and again, we fail to tell each other the truth. And in so doing, says John, we are leaving out a key ingredient in the recipe for real and healthy community. Because it is true, telling the truth, it might ruffle some feathers. But real grace, genuine mercy, authentic peace depend on us being real about what is going on around us, working through the tough stuff, having those difficult conversations, trusting that God is there in the process, working through me, working through you, and then coming together on the other side of that tough stuff with a better understanding of what it means to be in relationship, being honest with one another. To be a community marked by grace, mercy, and peace, says John, you need both love and truth. You cannot have one without the other. But simply acknowledging that is the case on an intellectual level doesn't really help us that much, does it? Because telling the truth is still pretty hard to do, and it's even harder to do well. And certainly there's got to be some middle ground there between not telling the truth at all and employing a rank and yank style to our church life. We'd be down to like 5 members if we did that, I think. So that is why we are so lucky. We are lucky that there is a tremendous case study in truth-telling to be found in the pages of the Old Testament, specifically in the book of 2 Samuel. And you may or may not know that the book of 2 Samuel details the life and times of the illustrious King David, Israel's most famous king, a king who was beloved both by God and by people. But for as beloved as King David was, he was a hot mess. We are talking, he was a deeply flawed individual. Case in point. 2 Samuel tells us that one evening from a perch high up in his castle, King David caught a glimpse of a woman named Bathsheba as she was bathing. David was struck by her beauty, and so he sent some servants out to ferret out who exactly she was. When the servants came back, they reported to David that her name was Bathsheba, and she happened to be the wife of his friend Uriah, who was a soldier in his army, who at that very moment was out fighting a war in David's name. But discovering that Bathsheba was already married, and what's more, married to his friend, did not slow David's roll at all. He sent for Bathsheba, and he slept with her. Then upon discovering that she had fallen pregnant, he conspired with his generals to orchestrate Uriah's death on the battlefield so that his dirty deeds would not be revealed to the world. Yeah, it's pretty hot. Like I said, he's a hot mess. And so in response, what does God do? God sends the prophet Nathan to David's court in order to confront him. But specifically, the way he has Nathan do that is by presenting a case before David. So we've got to keep in mind that this is a monarchy we're dealing with. So David is at once, he is the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch all wrapped up into one. So part of his job was to hear cases and pronounce his judgment on them. So Nathan shows up to court and he presents this case before King David. He says, King David, oh righteous King David, there was a rich man with great herds and massive tracts of lands, and he had a guest, and he wanted to throw a feast for this guest. And in order to throw that feast, he had to go and slaughter an animal. But rather than slaughtering one of his own many sheep, he went and he stole a sheep from a poor man who lived nearby. And the story tells us, 2 Samuel tells us, that sheep was the poor man's sole possession. And what's more, this is an actual detail included in 2 Samuel. That man loved that sheep as though he was a member of his own family. But that did not slow that rich man's roll at all. He stole that sheep and he slaughtered it. O righteous King David, what is your judgment on this case? Well, King David, of course, hearing this story, like any person with a modicum of human decency, he was outraged by the story that he heard, and he declared for one and all, the rich man deserves to die. And at that moment, the prophet Nathan steps back for the big reveal, and he says, aha, you are that man. And David's mind blown all over the throne room. But here's what I want us to pay attention to in that interaction between David and Nathan. Right? Nathan knew from the get-go that David was guilty. And so he could have showed up to court, put down his soapbox, stepped up on it, and shouted David down. As a prophet of God, that was well within his rights. But no, Nathan doesn't shout down David. He doesn't condemn David. He doesn't write vague, passive-aggressives about David on his social media accounts. No, instead, Nathan speaks to David in a way that doesn't make him defensive. Nathan speaks to David in a way that doesn't make him shut down. Nathan speaks to David in a way that he can actually hear. And because Nathan speaks to David in this way, David is convicted of his wrongdoing. And if we continued reading the story, we would see that he immediately repents and begins to make amends for his crimes. Now, if you have ever before heard that phrase, speaking the truth in love, have you heard that phrase, speak the truth in love, and you thought it sounded pretty, but you didn't know what it looks like in practical terms, right? This is what it looks like in practical terms. Nathan spoke the truth in love to David, and although David was completely in the wrong, the truth did not tear him down, but instead it lifted him up. Right? That's what speaking the truth in love looks like. That's what speaking the truth in love does. And that is what I want us to hold in our hearts. That the truth is not something that we have any reason to be afraid of. No matter how hard of a truth it is, no matter how uncomfortable a truth it is. Because when spoken in love, the truth does not tear us down, but instead it builds us up. It builds us up in grace, says John. It builds us up in mercy, and it builds us up in peace. As counterintuitive as it may seem. Amen.